This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. The Mitten, Goodnight Moon, The Snowy Day, Brown Bear, What Do You See? Those are just some of the picture books we love here at Connecticut Public. Picture books have long captured the imagination of kids, but they're not just for kids. Today, we'll explore the power of picture books and why they should be considered great literature. At least that's what children's author Mac Barnett thinks. He's written more than 60 books for kids, including the popular Shapes trilogy, Triangle, Square, and Circle. Mac is also the new U.S. National Ambassador for Young People's Literature at the Library of Congress and Every Child a Reader, which is a literacy nonprofit that provides educational materials for millions of young people across the U.S. Mac, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Catherine.
And for our listeners, we know you have some favorite picture books, and we would love to know what they are. Give us a call to let us know, 888-720-9677, or leave us a comment on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. So, Mac, super excited to have this conversation with you today. Let us know about your background, both as an author and as a reader. How did your reading and writing journey start?
Yeah, so I grew up loving picture books first. That was my introduction to reading. My mom would read me picture books every day at night, but especially in the afternoons after we got home. We would just sit next to each other on the couch and she would read picture books to me. And I remember my mom is very funny, wicked sense of humor, one of the funniest people I've ever met. And I remember her laughing so hard that she was crying when she was reading me picture books by James Marshall, especially. And I just thought, like, wow, if my mom thinks this book is hilarious and I think this book is hilarious, that must be really something special. So it was really picture books that first introduced me, I think, to the power of literature. And it never stopped. And now I write all kinds of books. I write novels, graphic novels, and picture books for kids. But the picture book is still my favorite art form. It's so exciting. It's so new. It's so experimental. And it's just like our audience, very young children, I think is the best audience for literature a writer could have.
And they give the most honest reviews, I imagine.
Oh, they do not mess around with you. They will just tell you it's boring halfway through your book. Yeah, it is. It's good training. I'm visiting elementary schools all week, and I think like standing in front of 100 second graders and reading them one of your stories, it's good training. It's writer boot camp for sure.
Right? Yeah, exactly. I can imagine that's probably one of the more stressful moments is having an audience of young people, and if they don't react, then something is happening or not happening.
I think you're right. I think it's why I love writing funny books because, like, at least then you have a laugh. Whereas, like, a silently interested kid and a bored kid sound exactly the same. So, yeah, it's probably why I throw jokes into my books.
Well, and then to ask you a really tough question early in the morning is, did you have favorite picture books as a child? And do you remember why you loved it, or why did it jump out to you in the first place?
Yeah, I think I really loved the Frog and Toad books. I still do. I think that they're as good as anything written in English. It's such a complex relationship. It's a complex friendship, right? I think that we think about that as a story about two opposite friends, which has become sort of a tried and true trope in children's books. But they are opposite in clean ways. And the friendship is beautiful, but also at times dysfunctional. And the emotions run so high. And I could just sense that even as a very young kid, that this was real, that these feelings were deep, that we were getting some sort of truth about what it meant to be a friend. And yeah, you could sense the real. And I think kids are so good at that. They can recognize when somebody's really talking to them about the world.
Well, I love that you mentioned Frog and Toad because it's definitely one of my favorites growing up and as an adult. And it's interesting because I think I did sense a lot of the realness when I was reading it as a kid, but certainly as an adult, I got a lot more of the nuances reading them today versus when I was read it during my childhood. And you mentioned that you spend so much time in the afternoons with your mom, having her read to you. What did your reading routine look like as a child?
Yeah, so it looked like I would get home from school, and my mom would read to me. When I started being able to read by myself, I was just basically reading all the time. But when it was centered around picture books, it was before dinner and then again at bedtime. I think that's one of the cool things about picture books is they can become part of a family's routine this way. They are shared stories, right? Same thing in the classroom. They're a story that all the students hear, that you and your classmates all know. And you may love the story and the kid sitting next to you hated it, right? And you can talk about that. We don't have to feel the same way about a story to sort of be united by the experience of listening to it. But yeah, I think for my mom and me, these picture books became part of our like shared vocabulary, our inside jokes, the way that we made sense of the world. And that is so powerful, right? Still as an author now, when families come up and they say, like, I got to tell you that, we always say this line from your book whenever something bad happens to us. Like, there's no greater compliment than that. It's such powerful stuff.
Well, and that's so fascinating, right? Where you're able to embrace that as a kid and continue that as an adult, which is so, I think that's such a wonderful experience. And the fact that you can do that is also, I mean, it's just awesome to hear that an adult can do that, right? Because I remember having to defend myself sometimes with adults in my life where I'm reading a picture book or a graphic novel or a comic. And of course, you hear the ubiquitous, that's not real literature or that's not a real book. And then I mean, a sassy kid, my comeback is always like, well, an adult wrote this. So are you going to tell me that this is not a real book? And I think people often dismiss picture books as books for kids and or just books for kids and early readers. And I think in an interview with All Things Considered, you said that picture books are both an art form and they're also real literature. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, I think, this happens to picture book writers all the time too. People will ask me, do you think you'll ever write a real book? And it makes me absolutely furious, not because it dismisses my work, but because it dismisses the audience. If you don't think picture books are real literature, then you don't think children are real people. Kids have deep emotional lives. They ask huge questions. They're little philosophers, right? And they need a literature that reflects their life. I think that picture books are dismissed. And I think they're dismissed for two reasons. One, we don't really understand how picture books work, right? It's a unique art form. And no other type of literature or storytelling works exactly like it. It's words and pictures telling a story together. But also the human voice is usually involved. An adult is reading this book out loud. The human body is involved. It has aspects of theater and dance, right? The pace at which the adult is turning the pages, the angle between the arm and the face and the body. All of these things are part of the artwork that is the picture book. The other reason, though, that picture books are dismissed is because we dismiss kids. We underestimate them and we figure, how could this be real art? Because kids can't appreciate real art. I think we have this model of attainment that we think that in order to understand art and literature, you have to spend a lifetime reading, years training, sort of this connoisseurship model. But I think that so many of the skills that we need to engage with literature are skills that we have at a very young age, and in fact are sharper. Kids are such keen observers of the world. They are so alive to the beauty of language. And they're actually, I think, more willing to do the work of interpreting a story than an adult is. Adults, when we come into contact with something that we don't immediately understand, we have a tendency to push that aside. We say, oh, that's tough, I don't get it. Oh, and then we'll say, like, that's self-indulgent or too weird. Kids are constantly engaging in a world that they don't fully understand and they want to figure out the rules for. And that's what experimental literature is. That's what literary fiction is, right? So they will just charge in there and think about a story and figure out what it means.
Well, and it's almost as if picture books crosses genres, right? Where it allows you to learn skills that perhaps other forms can't give that to you. Like you mentioned, there's performance, there's reading, there's language skills. So as a reader and an author, and now newly appointed U.S. National Ambassador for Young People's Literature, is it challenging to create a good picture book? What's your thought process like when you're creating?
It is. It's very easy to write a picture book. It's very hard to write a great picture book. I think that the most important thing is going to be that relationship between text and image. In a picture book, the words are giving you some information, and the pictures are giving you other pieces of information. And that shouldn't be redundant. There should actually be some sort of dynamic relationship between text and image. So sometimes the pictures are telling you a story that the words aren't aware of. Sometimes the words can be playing it very high and amplified, and the pictures can be playing it low and deadpan. Sometimes the words and the pictures don't exactly match up, right? And that's just like real life. We hear things about how the world works, and we see that it works differently. That happens to us every day. It especially happens to kids every day. They are constantly being told that the world works one way, and they are watching us adults, and they're saying, but you don't follow these rules at all. And I think there's something very cathartic about that relationship between text and image in the picture book, that it's another time that kids can see the limits of language, the limits of what adults tell them, because the world that they see with their eyes is so much more complicated than the one that is often described to them. But you also want to be thinking about the person reading this book out loud, right? When I publish a picture book, I am asking adults to sit there in front of a classroom or at bedtime and read this thing out loud, to put on this performance. And you want to be generous to that adult, make them look good, feel empowered, because really, like, I'm asking all of you to be an actor in a play that I wrote. And so, yeah, thinking about how many words are on a page, the opportunities to do voices, all these things to make adults feel empowered, because it can feel a little silly to read a picture book out loud.
And actually, with that in mind, too, I mean, there's nothing like getting called out by a kid and that gives you pause. And I think it's time for me to reflect if you're going to call me out that way. But with how you're describing the process, so you're thinking about, your reader, your younger readers, how they see the world. Do you think this also helps adults see what they're seeing and to understand kids better, maybe?
Yeah, I do. I think that picture books are one of the few places that adults and kids can meet as equals. And we're not used to, as adults, treating kids as equals, right? But as an author, I have to do that. A good story, the writer looks at the reader as an equal, and we engage with mutual respect. That relationship is foremost in a book. But also the adult reading the book out loud has to do that too. The adult is reading the same story as the kid. And it's a weird thing. As an adult who's reading a picture book to kids, you are both performer, but also audience. This is a story that you know. And oftentimes, if you discuss a picture book with a kid after you close the pages, you are going to learn things about that book that you did not know. This kid is going to be noticing things in the pictures that you missed. They're going to understand connections in the text that you weren't aware of. So I think it's very humbling and surprising to a lot of adults who read out loud to kids. They see just how smart, thoughtful, and just complicated children are.
Well, and even with just you describing that, I'm remembering that I used to read to my younger brother a lot, and I seem to recall memory of being in a really good mood afterwards because I'm performing, I'm hamming it up, I'm being really, really big with these characters, and so I guess in some way it was helpful for me as with my mood, I think. So what do we know about picture books that can help reading skills and language skills and maybe even maybe their mental health among children?
I think that, one of the things that we know is that the more words a kid is exposed to, the more words a kid hears out loud in young childhood, the better their educational outcomes will be their whole lives, right? This is one of these things that is incontrovertible. It has been studied. And picture books are one of the best ways to introduce new words into a kid's life. It's another misconception about picture books. People think that they're very simple, but again, because they're read by adults to kids, they're not read by kids. The syntax, the vocabulary, just the structure of language used is often really complex, and it's a great way as an adult to kind of get outside the sort of the vocabulary and words that you carry around with you, and introduce some new ones into the house. I think that picture books are often full of words that are unfamiliar to kids. Picture books are often full of words that are unfamiliar to adults too, and that's good. These are things that families can learn together, and those have benefits for kids all down the line.
And do you think it's important to let kids choose their own books?
Absolutely. I think that this is, we're talking about somebody forming their taste in art for their entire life. And I think that your reading with your kids should always be guided by their interests and passions. It's the most exciting thing to watch a young person form their taste. And I think as an adult, sometimes, you can be stuck reading a book that you feel is silly or long or boring. I feel, I have a 3-year-old, I read plenty of books that I don't like to him, but I do feel an obligation when I'm doing it. I'm going to give the best reading of that book. I'm going to do my best. I'm going to try to hit what that author thought they were hitting. Because, if he's interested in this stuff, if this is where his passion for literature is taking him, I don't want to sit there and make him feel silly for liking this book.
Right. And I'm going to jump into sort of an adult problem here, because I think that's how you described it. It's an adult problem when it comes to test scores. And earlier this year, we saw federal test scores show that reading skills are declining among children. And this is according to a report out of the New York Times. And there could be many reasons driving this, but what are some that maybe you've been thinking about? Could picture books help with that? And we're talking also across the ages too.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of reasons for this. And the reason that feels most relevant to my life and my work is, alongside this drop in test scores, there was a real drop in the number of kids who said that they love reading, a drop in the number of kids who say they read for pleasure. And I think that we have a tendency to think of children's books as teaching tools, as teaching life skills or teaching reading, really just as sort of a didactic literature. But that is not what literature is. The subject of literature is life itself. And if we get a love of literature, that's not going to teach you to read, but that is going to motivate you to learn to read. And that is going to keep you reading across your life. And I think that we are not always good at teaching or using literature as art. These are kids' earliest encounters with the beauty of language, with the beauty of art. And if we have that kind of joyous encounter with an artwork, if that is how we think about coming to children's literature, that's going to change the attitude of students who we're always screaming at to read, but don't always do a great job of communicating why this is such a beautiful thing to learn to do.
Well, we're going to continue diving into the beautiful things that are picture books. My guest today is Mac Barnett, who's the U.S. National Ambassador for Young People's Literature at the Library of Congress and Every Child a Reader, a literacy nonprofit. And he'll stay with us after the break. Where We Live producer Chloe Wynn shared that she loves The Little Old Lady Who's Not Afraid of Anything by Linda Williams. And she also gave a shout out to a classic, Corduroy by Don Freeman. Let us know what your favorite picture book is. Give us a call, 888-720-9677, or let us know on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. Did you have a reading routine as a kid? Or maybe you have one with your own kid today? Studies show that there are real benefits to reading aloud and that it can be an incredible impact on children. That's according to the nonprofit United Through Reading. Still with us is children's author Mac Barnett. He's also the U.S. National Ambassador for Young People's Literature at the Library of Congress. And in his role, he's putting the spotlight on picture books. So, Mac, we kind of talked about this a little bit in the previous segment, but what do you think about the idea of there being benefits of reading aloud to kids? Not just language or reading skills-wise, but other skills, perhaps.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that to me, the benefit of reading to kids really is having art in your life, in your family's life, in your classroom, right? The subject of children's literature is the subject of all literature. It's life itself, but the subject of children's literature is the life of a child, and those aspects of our life that are most relevant to what kids see and experience every day. And I think that, we all believe in the value of art. Sometimes that can be hard to communicate. We live in a particularly utilitarian time where we want measurable benefits to everything. And of course, as you said, there are measurable benefits to reading picture books. But what about those intangible benefits of having art as part of our daily life, at our families, at our schools? Those aren't always going to show up in a longitudinal study, but I think we all know intuitively that it enriches us. It makes us great critical thinkers. It just makes us know ourselves and the world we live in so much better. And so I think we have to make room for the picture book as just a pure literary experience as well.
Well, it's interesting thinking back on my own experience as we're having this conversation is I'm starting to remember more of the picture books that I was reading or being read to, and then realizing that how powerful those memories still stay with you. I think a lot of the pictures may be fuzzy right now, but you certainly remember the experiences, and it's so amazing to see the kind of picture books we have today that was not available, like, let's say, 10, 20, 30 years ago. How do you think we've seen picture books change and evolve? We mentioned some of our team's favorites at the top of the hour and titles that a lot of us are familiar with, but certainly this particular genre has expanded since the days of Goodnight Moon.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that look, the picture book is a form, right? It is a way of telling stories. It is not just specifically a genre. I think a lot of us would think, like, what is a picture book? It is cute animals who talk and live in houses and learn life lessons, usually at the very last page, right? But you can tell any kind of story this way. And so you can tell there's amazing works of nonfiction in picture books that are explaining science or engaged in history. There are picture book memoirs. We're still figuring out what this art form can do. It's a very young art form. The first picture book in my mind is Millions of Cats, which came out in 1928. So we're talking about an art form that is less than 100 years old. And it's very exciting. We're still learning how to tell stories this way. And every year I will see picture books that do something, that have some trick, some move that it absolutely blows my mind. I had no idea a picture book could do that. It's so exciting to be making this kind of work.
Well, it makes me super excited to hear you talking about picture books that dive into science and history, because I actually recently had a moment where it's kind of hard for me to keep my attention on nonfiction books. I love them, but for some reason my attention span is not so great with it right now. But I was actually thinking maybe I should jump into picture books for sciencey things, and I'll actually learn things, and there's pictures. Do you think there's some value to that with an adult coming in thinking, I think that's the way for me to go to learn about that particular thing?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, every signing that I do, there'll be some adults kind of at the back of the line who will shamefacedly come up and say, we don't have kids. I'm just here because I love picture books. And of course, we're always like, well, we love picture books too. That please do not be ashamed. But there's amazing stuff out there. If you're interested in science, particularly the work of Jason Chin, who won the Caldecott a couple of years ago, which is our highest award for picture book illustration. He writes primarily nonfiction and especially about science. And I know that my understanding of my place in the world and nature has been deepened by reading Jason's work.
Well, adding that to the never-ending list of books I need to read and check out. And with the evolution too over the years, over the decades, are you seeing more diverse characters and even stories in picture books that may look different, compared to when you were growing up? And what does that look like today?
I think that's been something that children's publishing has been working at, very intently in the last few years. And I think that, look, this is literature, right? Why do we read? Well, one reason is to read about the lives of people like us, and then also people who are different from us too, our classmates, our neighbors, the people who we live across, who may live across the country or across the world. And that's just as true with picture books as it is any other kind of literature. A difference with picture books always, we keep coming back to the visual. You can see characters in picture books immediately on the covers and in these pages. We know what they look like. And so there's an illustrator, Christian Robinson, if you're not familiar with his work. He's an author and illustrator, one of the best picture book makers alive. He posted a video essay the other day called Reclaiming Our Hair, Thoughts on Black Hair in Picture Books. And you can see kind of the care that he is putting into hairstyles, especially hairstyles on the young girls in his books. And he speaks about this and he shows the way you can watch him paint. It's amazing. I would really recommend it. And I think it shows the stakes for picture book artists who sit down and have to populate our books with the people that we live with, the people who we share the world with.
Well, and then based on what you just shared too, I wanted to ask you, what do you think the impact is of seeing yourself and your story in picture books as a young reader? So I still want to ask that question, but I also am curious, what do you think the impact is for an adult reader?
Oh, that's a great question. I think that the immediate impact is that you see that you are included in our national literature, in our national story, and I think that's incredibly powerful. Christian put in this essay too. He had a quote from Octavia Butler: "What we don't see, we assume can't be. What a destructive assumption!" Right? For an adult coming back, I imagine, an adult who didn't always see themselves in their literature as a child to return to it now, and to see the way that it's changed. I think it can be just as powerful, maybe even more so. I don't want to give away. Everybody should go read Christian's essay because it answers your question even better than I can. But it's like it has so much to. Go, everybody.
Yeah, we're adding that to the list. The never-ending list.
Reclaiming Our Hair by Christian Robinson. ChristianRobinson.substack.com, because he's got a beautiful answer, but it's sort of the turn that his essay makes.
Well, and then we have talked about too where picture books is so much more than quote just the pictures, just the very short stories. They stay with you for a very long time, as I think we're witnessing here today. How have you seen picture books tackle big topics, things like death, tragedy, war, family dynamics? These are all really heavy topics for both young and adult readers alike, but to see it presented in a picture book, it hits a little different.
Yeah, I think, maybe let's just take death as an example here.
Sure.
This is something that young kids ask a lot about. My son is in that phase too. He's got a lot of questions about death. And they're very matter-of-fact questions, genuinely curious. There's emotion behind them, but I find that kids are much more comfortable asking about death than adults are. We kind of seize up, and there's something so saddening and just stressful about seeing a young kid start to ask about death. But if we give pat answers or dismiss or evade deep, hard questions that young children have about the world, oh, what a dereliction of duty. And look, we're not going to be perfect as adults who are getting questions from kids in real time, right. but literature's job is to engage with these big questions. And it's another reason kids are such a great audience. They're constantly asking, what is death? What happens after we die? What is love? Why do we go to war? What does God's face look like? Why is the sky blue? And you'll just be like, oh man, it's like the sun's reflecting the ocean or the other way around. Oh, I'm supposed to know this. But these are the questions that artists, that poets, that writers have been asking for centuries. And they are the questions that children's authors have engaged in too. And you can find beautiful picture books about death, war, just all of these deep and sort of darker emotions that, sure, we'd love to exclude from children's lives, but that's a folly. And if children are seeing and experiencing these things, they need a literature that reflects this world too. And I think often the best of these books don't provide easy answers, but just sort of ask questions alongside kids. And that can be really comforting too. I think as adults, sometimes we feel like we have to have the answers to everything, that is our job, that when a kid gives us an answer, we have to say something definitive, even if it's simplistic or not true. And it can be a comfort just to sit there and wonder about the world, which is something that literature and stories is particularly good at.
Well, do you think when picture books are able to explore those topics, perhaps the adult never had a chance to explore during their own childhood or even into adulthood, does it help the adult sort of process how to present that question to their kids?
I think that, yeah, not only process how to present it, but a picture book can kind of act as an instant book club. When you finish up, you and a kid have read the same story. And ideally, it's an opportunity to talk. That's where I feel like my books really live. It's after you shut the covers. And if I've done my job, now you have something to talk about with your child. And those discussions are so valuable. And so if you don't know where to start, or even if you find something in a book that you're like, that's not how I see the world. I actually, I don't think somebody should have done this in that book. Or, well, like these are opportunities to have discussions with your kid and also to ask them questions and really find out what they think about the story they just read. In doing so, you'll learn what they think about the world they live in.
Well, and another area that is really sort of top of mind and certainly a part of a lot of conversations recently are book challenges, and we're seeing them across America, including here in Connecticut. And just recently, the Connecticut legislature introduced a bill that could help protect Connecticut libraries from these bans. Last year, the book Entangle Makes Three was pulled from library shelves in Florida. This is a book about two male penguins at the Central Park Zoo raising a chick, and this is according to the New York Times. Can you respond to what we're seeing here today in regards to picture books being subject to book challenges and book bans?
Yeah, I mean, I love libraries. I grew up in libraries, and I'll just tell you how I was raised. And some of this is the way that I was raised by libraries, but also the way that I was raised by my mom. We would go to the library every week, and she would just set me loose. And I would grab a bunch of picture books, but I could go wherever I wanted in the library, and I could grab books off the shelf, whatever topic I was interested in, bring them back to my mom, who would put them in a big tote bag, and then we would check those books out. And I was limited only by the number of books you were allowed to check out each week. Did my mom like every book that I selected? No, she did not. My mom is very opinionated, and she always talked to me. And if she if she disagreed with a book that I checked out, if she didn't like it, we would talk about it. And that was really cool. Those are some of the most vivid memories I have, are just conversations with my mom about books. Could I ever imagine her saying like, "Oh, Mackie, like this book is check it out in a couple years." Yeah, I don't have any memory of that ever happening. Of course, like it would have been her right to. You have a say over what books your kids read, but could I imagine my mom ever snatching a book out of another kid's hand, telling another person's kid what they can and can't read? And no, I cannot. My mom would not have done that.
And can you, just based on your experience, especially today, with your own childhood experience and seeing what's happening right now, why do you think picture books are being targeted in this way?
I think that look, children's books are, they're important. We all agree that they are the first way that we start to explain and show the world to kids. And I think that, art is always at the center of the culture war, right? This is culture. And I think that it's a testament to how real, how powerful these stories are. Yeah.
With us today is Mac Barnett. He's a U.S. National Ambassador for Young People's Literature at the Library of Congress, and he's going to stay with us after the break. We want to hear from you about your favorite picture book or maybe what you're reading to the kid in your life. Let us know, 888-720-9677, or leave us a comment on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. Senior health reporter Sujata Srinivasan mentioned to us that she loves Stregonona by Connecticut author Tommy DePaola, and our technical producer Dylan Reyes loves The Polar Express. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. This hour, we're talking about the awe and wonder that picture books inspire at any age. These pieces of literature can inspire young readers to become lifelong book lovers at any age. Connecticut Public Deputy Director of Storytelling, Robin Doyon-Aiken, shared with us, "For my kids, picture books were a gateway to graphic novels, which they still love as a teen and young adult." Joining us now is a familiar voice for Where We Live listeners. Kym Powe is the Children and Young Adult Consultant for the Connecticut State Library. Kym, welcome back to the show.
Hi, Catherine. Thank you for having me.
Of course, and still with us is Mac Barnett, who is the U.S. National Ambassador for Young People's Literature at the Library of Congress. So, Kym, I want to jump straight to you. I know you've been following along the conversation. Anything that jumped out to you that you want to respond?
All of it, I guess.
I had a feeling that's what you were going to say.
Yes. I think, honestly, everything resonated, particularly thinking about the illustrations that come along with the sort of like literary portions of picture books. I am a huge picture book fan. I always have been. I think maybe I was always going to be a librarian, but like didn't know it until it was sort of the right time. But there can be something so powerful about the illustrations that complement a story. And what I love most about kids and doing story times when I was working at public libraries is that they see all of it. They see the things you saw, they see the things you didn't see, and they have a lot to say about it. And it really can contribute to the conversation that adults and kids can have around the story that's being told, not only from the perspective of the words, but of the illustrations as well. And I will forever love authors and illustrators, and those authors who are both It could never be me, but I will always appreciate, uplift, and have conversations with children and other adults about them.
I mean, we can inspire, right?
Yes, I can dream. I can collage art, maybe. I can do that, maybe one day.
Well, Mac's laughing, but we can aspire, I think. And Kym, because you mentioned storytime events, and they're really popular across Connecticut libraries. Can you talk about the impact of being read aloud to?
It's huge. And one of the best impacts, I think, about being read aloud to is that typically the children and even some of the adults don't even realize the impact that's happening as it's happening. So, rhyming books were always my favorites because it gave kids the opportunity to sort of predict what was going to come next. The Karma Wilson books are really great for that. They could predict the color yellow was coming based off of the previous rhyming word. And not only is it a fun experience and it becomes an interactive experience with kids, particularly in a storytime setting, but it's contributing to things like phonemic awareness, right? Sort of breaking down an understanding of words. The children don't realize that that's what's happening as they are picking up sort of what the next possible rhyming word may be, but that's what's happening. But we're all able to have a good time about it. And it doesn't have to be super educational, but it's there. It's there and it's prevalent and it's having a huge impact.
And do you have any advice for adults who want to start reading aloud to kids in their lives? How do you do that? How do you make sure that you are doing it in a way that they're interested? And you don't have to cultivate a reading habit, but it's good to do.
Yeah. And I think sometimes you're going to cultivate that reading habit, whether you set out to do it or not.
Right.
But it's something that you all were talking about already. Let the kids pick the books. Let the kids pick the books. And they're going to find a cover that jumps out to them. They're going to already love trucks or unicorns or something like that. And they're going to gravitate towards the cover of a book. I think it can be nerve-wracking to some parents reading out loud. I've always been a reader, but I remember having to read different paragraphs out loud in school. The absolute panic, right? Of am I going to stumble over a word? Do I know how to pronounce X, Y, or Z? But the children don't care, right? For the most part, they just want to be there with you. And I think something that we adults can do is we can sort of stop thinking we have to know the answers to everything and how to do everything. And we can learn with the kids. And we can even say, you know what? I'm not sure how to say that word either. Let's go see if we can figure it out together. And I hope that kind of removes some of the stress and anxiety of reading out loud, even to your own child. And I want to acknowledge that it's there, it's real. And I get it, but turn it into a learning moment together to sort of alleviate some of that anxiety.
I think
I feel like, sorry.
No, I was going to ask you to respond, Mac.
This keeps coming up as a theme, right? Is that picture books are a place where we can kind of get away from these roles of authority and control that we always have with kids and just enjoy a story together. And I think that to get ready to read a picture book out loud, it's always good to read it before you read it to a kid so you know what's coming. Also, when the pictures are always so important. And when you were an adult reading a picture book out loud, you were usually so focused on these words and getting them right that you don't have time to look at these pictures as closely as the kids do. And so if you want to talk about the book, you're going to need to know what was happening in those pictures. I think adults can use funny voices, just push yourself to have fun doing this, even if it feels silly, and you want to feel like a good, strong authority figure when you're around kids all the time. Now is a time to let that go and have fun doing this. The adult reading the picture book out loud is so important to the process, right? I write picture books. I don't illustrate them. So when I write a story, I then pass it on to an illustrator. And that is the first person who is going to go through and interpret my words and extend the story, right? It's not just going to be illustrating my story, but they're going to be making authorial decisions with these pictures. Well, the adult who reads the picture book out loud is also going to make authorial decisions. If you read a picture book out loud to a kid, you are an artist, you are a performer, you are part of making this picture book. You are going to choose what these characters sound like. You are going to choose how fast or how slow to go. You were going to put a page turn in where maybe the illustrator didn't do it. You are going to cut a line of text that I spent 3 weeks getting right and just perfect. And then you just cut it. And that's fine, because this book is yours. You are reading this book out loud now, and it will never be read out loud the way you read it to that kid right then. And I really just to see yourself as not just somebody who's introducing a story to kids, but who is making that story. We're all existing in the service of these kids having a good experience. And really, ideally, when we're all done, there should still be gaps in that story and room for the kid, the child reader, to bring their intelligence and their experience to the story and figure out what it means to them. We don't tell them what it means. We invite them to make that meaning by bringing their life into contact with.
You know what we're doing with that, Mac? We're making the story with the kids. That's what we're doing in that moment. The child and the adult are co-creating that story together, especially when you can do it sort of in a one-on-one stance, which doesn't always happen in like a story time setting, but you can allow that child to take over. And next thing you know, like maybe you're not reading the words at all. And we appreciate the 3 weeks that you put into that line. We may cut it, but we appreciate that it's there. But sometimes next thing you know, you're not reading the words at all, right? Even though a picture book has words in it, that adult and that child are now just telling the story through the graphics. And it might as well be a wordless picture book, which also does not get nearly the amount of love. I am here for the wordless picture book. But now they are just like, they are creating a story of their own, which might be so different from the words that were put in there. But like, that's okay. And then maybe you go back and you do read the words that are in the book. But that co-creation between the adult and the child around that picture book is so beautiful and should have so much value.
Well, clearly we can go days for this, but obviously when you're having fun, time flies really quickly. And I know we need 5 hours just to get a book recommendation. But Kym, any book recommendations you have for our listeners, both picture books, wordless picture books, anything you recommend?
So many. Kyle Lukoff has a recently new book that came out called I'm Sorry You Got Mad. And it's a really precious story about a child who has made another child upset in class and spends the entire book trying to write an apology letter and trying to write the apology letter the right way, the correct way. And throughout the story, you figure out exactly why they knocked over the block castle of the other child. But sort of watching them go through that process of being angry and cranky is one that anyone who has been around a child can understand, or even who's been cranky themselves for like a really silly reason. It is a big favorite of mine, along with a childhood favorite, The True Story of the Three Little Pigs. Anyone who is an old millennial like I am is probably familiar with the story, and I'm on the wolf side forever. I don't care what anyone has to say about it.
Oh, snap. That's strong words. I just want to share real quick that Jen on Facebook says she loved Island Born by Junot Diaz. Thank you so much, Jen, for sharing that with us. Got about 30 seconds here, but Mac, any final thoughts for our listeners?
You know what? I'm in a recommendation mood too. X-Fang, the Pumphrey brothers, Emily Hughes, Jessica Bagley. These are all some newer picture book writers who are doing great work.
And we will have all of that on a list on our webpage later on ctpublic.org/where we live for our listeners. So you can check all of the recommendations that's been mentioned today. I want to thank Mac Barnett, who's the U.S. National Ambassador for Young People's Literature at the Library of Congress. Mac, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.
And you were also listening to Kym Powe, who's a children and young adult consultant for the Connecticut State Library. Thank you so much, Kym, for joining us this morning as well.
Thank you for having me again.
I'm Catherine Shen. Today's show is produced by Tess Terrible. Our technical producer is Dylan Reyes. Download Where We Live anytime on your favorite podcast app. Thank you so much for listening, and happy reading and happy reading aloud, everyone.